Okay, yeah, it works. It was like this, right? Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. Let me start with a brief introduction of the organizers, essentially, because it's not just Rosa Luxemburg and Hela Panke, it's also School of Materialist Research. I'll say a couple of words about us. School of Materialist Research is a platform of universities. It's founded by Arizona State University, the Center for Philosophical Technologies, Technical University of Vienna, the Philosophy of Technology and Architecture Department, Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities, Skopje, Eindhoven Academy of Design, and soon we will have Nijmegen University joining us, and Goldsmiths as well as part of our Summer Institute program. So this is us institutionally. We have partners as well. We offer informal graduate level education, which looks pretty much like this panel tonight. Even though it's graduate level, we do not require any certificate for anybody to participate in it, as long as you feel you're up to the level of conversation. The name materialist and the title says a lot. Not all of us are Marxists, but many are. We entertain other forms of materialism as well and realisms. We're very much interested in close conversations between philosophy and sciences in particular. As for tonight's topic, I assume you're all familiar with it, with the abstracts, with the bios of the speakers. We decided not to take any of the time for this purpose. You have next to the participants list or right on the exit, I don't know where they are, the printouts of the bios of all of the speakers. We will begin with Paul Cockshott, with whose work some of you are familiar, maybe even in German, because he has been translated, several of his titles have been translated in German, including How the World Works. Frank Engster is a theorist of a Marxian philosopher of theory of value, with a rich portfolio of interesting titles and one huge book on money and time, which is a fascinating read. Keti Chukhrov is somebody who's written quite a lot on Marxist theory. She combines her knowledge background in economics or her prior affiliation with the Institute of Economics in Moscow, but also her later interest in theory of theater and performing arts. So it's quite a variety of approaches. I will give the floor first to Paul, then we'll go with Frank, and in the end we will have Keti, and then we will open the floor for all of you for questions, discussion, debate, etc.
Okay, thank you, Katarina, for the introduction. The talk I'm going to give will cover material which on the one hand may initially seem familiar, that if you've read Marx, you'll have read the stuff. On the other hand, it'll seem unfamiliar because it draws heavily on ideas which were developed post-Marx in the formal mathematical sciences. Now, a bit about my own background. I started out training as a Marxist economist under Steedman in Manchester, and I became interested in doing concrete empirical Marxist studies. And for that, I realized I needed to learn computer science in order to be able to process the data. Now, computer science as a subject grew out of the development of logic and debates about formal systems in the early 20th century. And its founding paper by Turing is about the properties of formal systems and whether they can be proven or not. So, as computer scientists, we approach everything in terms of its formal properties. And as such, that seems to fit very well with considering value form. But if you come to it as a computer scientist, you come to the topic of value form in, if I may say so, a much more strictly formal sense. In the formal sense that 20th century logic developed. So that's just a wee introduction. When Marx describes what he's doing in Capital, he says he's attempting to uncover the laws of motion of capitalist society. Now, often people take that as a rather metaphorical use of the word laws of motion. I'm saying no, it isn't metaphorical. It's actually strict. Marx was taking it literally in the Newtonian sense. He was attempting to uncover laws of motion in exactly the same sense as Newton and the then contemporary 19th century mechanics explained the laws of motion. He wanted to show that capitalist exchange is governed by objective regularities, quantitative regularities, that are just the same sort of thing as the quantitative regularities that are observed in the motion of other forms of matter. So I'm going to be talking about equivalence relations, because this is what Capital starts out with. What we are saying is that Capital is concerned with establishing that commodity exchange is an equivalence relation. So what does a relation mean? In modern logic, a relation from a set A to a set B is a set of pairs with drawing one element from A, one element from B. Now, that may not appear evident to people, but all of the sort of mathematical relations that one's used to, like greater than or less than, can all be expressed in terms of sets of pairs like that. And that's how modern mathematics considers a relation. And Marx presents commodity exchange in exactly this form. If you've read Capital, all these will be familiar to you. They're all taken from the first volume of Capital, first chapter of Capital. 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat. 1 coat is equal to 20 yards of linen. 1 coat equals 2 ounces of gold, etc. All of these are examples taken from him. All I've done is put angle brackets around them and put commas around them, which is the modern mathematical notation for expressing that. There's a slight change in typography, but essentially the same thing is there. Now, when I say it's a slight change in typography, this is actually how the capitalist system works. If you carry out any commodity exchange with your debit card now, the whole thing goes via relational databases. And relational databases are based on sets of tuples like this, sets of pairs. That's what's actually stored in the computers. The whole financial system is actually based on this logic which was formally developed by Codd in the 1960s and was realized to be what the capitalist system needed to automate itself. So the formal logic that I'm talking about actually is the material logic that underlies the computer systems that the whole capitalist system runs on now. Now, I'm going to go through a bit more about the properties of relations. If you've got two relations, you can in principle compose them. And in logic, we do that by putting a little circle between the two relations. And what it says is if A and B exist in H, there will be an A and C in F and a C and B in G, such that you have the combined relation between them. And in logic, we call the C, this C which mediates the relation, we call it the witness element. Now that's a term in modern logic, but it's there in Marx's notation. Marx's notation, CMC, is the composition of the exchange relation with itself, in modern logic terms, and money acts as the witness element that is described in modern relational algebra. Now, well, I'm going the wrong way. I'm continuing to go the wrong way, sorry. Here we are. Relations can also be reflexive. That's to say, A and A are the same relation, are in the relation. That is to say, one coat is worth one coat. If they're symmetric, if one coat is worth 20 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen are worth one coat. Marx explicitly says that relation has that property. The exchange relation has that property. Then there is the property of transitivity. If A and B are in the relation and B and C are in the relation, then A and C are in the relation. If one coat is worth 20 yards of linen and 20 yards of linen are worth 10 pounds of tea, one coat is worth 10 pounds of tea. So symmetry, reflexivity, and transitivity are what's logically required for an equivalence relation. Now, what does an equivalence relation do? It subdivides sets into classes which are disjoint. Now, why is that significant? It means if you take all the things which are equivalent to one coat, you will not find anything in that set, whether it's 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea, 1 ounce of gold, you'll find nothing in that set which is equivalent to two coats. It has to be a distinct subset that is established by the exchange relation. So it's disjoint subject sets. Now, this modern formalism of relations and equivalence relations didn't exist in mathematics at the time Marx was writing Capital. But he insists all the properties that are required for treating things as an equivalence relation. And the value form argument that Marx presents in Capital, which I must say, when I first came across it, I thought, this is very labored. Why does he go through all these different tabular equivalence things? It wasn't until I learned enough formal logic that I realized what he's going for there. And that at the time he was writing, he was struggling to express this at a time when the logicians hadn't come up with the maths for it. Now, he anticipates the framework used in modern maths in this analysis. But he does more than that. He does more than just divide commodities into disjoint subject sets. He says that at least in lots of places in the argument, he implies that value has a greater than or less than relationship. If one coat is worth 20 yards of linen, he's assuming that 30 yards of linen are worth more than one coat. Okay, so that there is such a thing as one thing being more valuable than another. It's not just that one thing is equal to another, one thing can be more than another. In fact, the whole analysis of surplus value doesn't make any sense unless one thing can be worth more than another. So he's going beyond equivalence relations and going to what in modern maths we'd be talking about a metric space. And he comes close to actually using the right kind of language for this. Because he says, for example, to calculate it and compare the areas of rectilinear figures, we decompose them into triangles. But the area of a triangle itself is expressed by half the product of its base and its amplitude. So he's saying that in order to analyze a quantitative thing like value, you decompose it into smaller elements. And he's using an explicit geometric analogy here. And he's using Euclidean geometry, because that's the only geometry available to him at the time. And although it may not be immediately obvious, Marx knew enough about his classics to know that he's referring here to Archimedes. He's referring to Archimedes' technique of discovering the relationship between the radius of an area, the circumference and area of a circle. Archimedes' technique for proving the area of a circle was pi r squared, was based on exactly that decomposition that Marx refers to. Now, here is something else. In Euclidean geometry, there is a deep relationship between what we've been talking about and the circle. The circle, in Euclid's definition, is the set of all points that are equidistant from the origin. Now, we've just said that Marx's argument about equivalence relations divides commodity space into partitions of equal value. This is the same thing as Euclidean geometry does with the definition of a circle. Now, I'm next going to show that, in fact, you can't use Euclid for what Marx is doing. That what Marx is doing demands something beyond Euclidean geometry, and post-Euclidean geometry was not generally understood at the time he was writing. Now, let's assume that Euclid holds true for capitalism, and that Marx says that one coat is 20 yards of linen. Let's represent commodities as bundles X, Y, where X is a number of coats and Y is measured in 20-yard units of linen. Okay? Then the equivalence relation says 1, 0 is equal to 0, 1. They're equivalent. Now, if capitalism followed Euclid's laws, then it would follow that this relationship holds x squared plus y squared equals 1. Now, that certainly holds true for these two cases here, because square of 1 is the same thing. But it also would imply that by commodity exchange, you should be able to exchange one coat for 0.8 coats and 0.6 units of linen. Why should you be able to do that? Because the sum of the squares is the same, and by Pythagoras' theorem, they ought to be the same. But this leads you into a contradiction, if that actually happened under capitalism. What would be the contradiction? Well, at the market rate, 6 linen units is equal to 12 yard, 0.6 linen units is 12 yards, 0.6 coats. So starting off with one coat, I could trade it and end up with 1.4 coats. If Euclid's geometry actually held under capitalism. If that were the case, there'd be no problem obtaining surplus value. You just have to move along the circle, back again, and you end up with more. But we know that simple commodity exchange doesn't enable you to do that. So Pythagoras' theorem can't apply to commodity exchange. As I say, in Marx's time, geometry simply meant Euclidean geometry, and there was no general way of explaining a distance function. So I'm going to go on what actually is the distance function of capitalism and why it is crucial to understand that distance function, to understand credit, and to understand the impossibility of a debtor ever escaping from debt. Now, to do that, I'm going to use ideas about metric spaces, which weren't invented to the early 20th century. And basically, a metric space is a space with a distance function on it. And a distance function is something that says, take 2 points, and it'll give you the distance between them as a number. Pythagoras' theorem was the first way that was discovered of doing that. And it's perfectly valid for working on a flat surface. But there's another one. Suppose you live in New York and you want to find the distance you will have to walk between 2 points in the city. Pythagoras' theorem is no good for that because you can't walk diagonally in New York. The streets are on a regular grid. North, south, east, west. So you have to count how many streets you're going to have to walk north, how many street blocks are you going to have to walk east. So the distance in New York is the distance north plus the distance east, not the square root of the sum of the squares of the distances. And that's called the L1 metric in maths, or sometimes called Manhattan metric. And this, then, I'm going to draw pictures here. You know what a circle is. In Manhattan space, a circle looks like a diamond because this diamond is the set of points whose north distance and east-west distance sum to 1. Now, this is actually very much closer to what operates in commodity exchange, because we've already said commodity exchange can't, as an empirical observation, we see that commodity exchange doesn't follow Euclid. It follows something much closer to this. But this has a problem, because this says that 1 coat is equal to 1 20-yard unit of linen and any linear combination between, which is fair enough. But it also says it's equivalent to having -1 coat, because under the Manhattan distance, they're the same distance away. But having 1 coat and having -1 coat are not the same thing, because in one case you're a creditor, in the other case you're a debtor. The absolute value of your debt or the absolute value of your surplus is the same, but they're not the same position to be in at all. So we have to say what actually governs it. I'm going to move a bit faster here. What you actually have in commodity space is you take x plus y and then take its absolute value. You take the number of coats you have, whether it's plus or minus, and the number of units of linen that you have, whether it's plus or minus, add them together, and then you take the absolute value of that. You subtract the debts from the credits. Now, that's not immediately obvious in the previous formulations, and this is something specific to capitalist commodity exchange. It's not something that you encounter in everyday geometry, even in New York City, you don't encounter that. This is the logic of capitalist exchange. I can start off with one coat, and without making any loss, I can end up with 20 yards of linen. But I can continue getting more linen, provided I get into debt on coats. I can move anywhere on that line. Now, I'm saying coats, but if you said money and linen, it becomes much more obvious. You can go into negative amounts of money and acquire positive amounts of commodities. But this is the mirror image of it. It's the line defined by the value form, and I just said the value form is the absolute value of x plus y. It's the line defined by the value form on which all debtors sit. Now, by commodity exchange, you can move anywhere along that line. A debtor, by commodity exchange, can move anywhere along that line. But a debtor can never jump from there to there by commodity exchange. So once you're in a net debt position, commodity exchange will never get you into a credit position. And that is part of the logic of the form. Okay, now what's this got to do with conservation laws? The point is that this relationship, this 45-degree slope relationship, is a very familiar structure to physicists. It's a relationship, for example, between the total energy, E, and the kinetic and potential energy. The sum of the kinetic and potential energy add up to E here. And when something moves, when something falls, you're getting an equivalent exchange between potential and kinetic energy, and between all positions along the line. And this is why what Marx is doing is the same as what Newton is doing. It's establishing the formal properties of the equivalence relation which governs the motion. They sum to a constant sum. And that is the characteristic of any system governed by a conservation law in physics. Any system with a conservation law has that property. You also get it in thermodynamics. And it is no coincidence, I think, that in the couple of years before writing Capital, Marx had been attending lectures on thermodynamics at the Royal Institute. The notions of the conservation of energy were becoming diffused into popular science by lectures at the Royal Society at the time he was writing. And we know he is exchanging letters with Engels at the time about the conservation of energy. The actual formal structure that he lays out for commodity exchange is the formal structure of a system governed by a conservation law. Now, the geometry shows that commodity exchange preserves some underlying magnitude. When people were talking about the conservation of energy, energy was an abstract concept which they were inventing to explain the observed conservation law. Okay? They observed that height times weight providing one axis, and square of velocity times mass providing the other axis. If you add those together, you get something constant. And they call that energy. Now, Marx is doing the same thing. He's saying there's an abstract something that's being conserved behind this, and I'm calling it value. And I want to find out what it actually is. And he says what it is labor time. It's abstract social labor time. That is what is being conserved in these relations. Now, you can't establish that purely by abstract thought. At the time he was writing, it was already pretty widely accepted within economics that the substance of value was labor, because of the work of Smith and Ricardo. It wasn't until after Marx had published Capital that you start getting, oh my God, we can't say that. We must say it comes from something else. Perhaps it's subjective desire. It wasn't until after Marx that the idea that it was something other than labor started to be popularized. So he didn't have to prove the point about it being labor. He could just rely on the fact that prior political economists had made the same general point in the past. But in essence, it's an empirical question. In principle, you could have this value form, you could have this conservation law, and it could actually be energy that was being conserved in commodity exchanges. It could be the amount of energy that was required to make something. It could be the amount of electricity or the amount of coal that was used to make something. That would give you the same abstract value form. So whether the value form is caused by coal, energy, or human labor is an empirical question. It's not a moral question. Marx's law of value makes predictions. It's not an abstract moral principle. It's saying something about the regularities of the real world. It says sectoral labor values. If you can work out the amount of labor that goes in to produce the output of a given industry, that should give you a pretty good prediction of what that industry's output will sell for. He's saying that exchange preserves total value. There's a conservation law there. And if that's the case, the consequence of that is that there will be extremely high correlations between the labor contents of an industry's output and what it sells for. They'll be highly correlated, and that's an empirical prediction. And this is something that modern Marxist empirical economics has validated. It really became possible to do this research from, in principle, it could have been started in the 1960s, but it depended on national input-output tables being published. And the background to that was the ideas developed in Soviet planning in the 1920s, which were moved to the West when Leontiev got a job at Harvard and started to produce input-output tables for the United States, and then this became standardized. So ideas which originated in socialist planning became the standard method of preparing economic tables for capitalist countries. And you can use those tables to work out how much labor is required directly and indirectly to produce the output of every industry in the country. And we did this back in the 1990s for the UK, and we found that if you simply assume that wages are the same in every industry, the national average wage applies in every industry, and therefore you take the wage bills and divide it by the national average wage to say the number of hours worked in each industry. You get a 95.5% correlation between the amount of labor used directly and indirectly in an industry and what the industry's output sells for. Now, as it happens, the Ricardo, back about 1810 or so, said the labor theory of value would be 93% correct. And he was almost spot on there. If you exclude the oil industry, which according to Ricardian and Marxist theory should be earning differential rent and therefore selling its output above value, if you exclude the oil industry, the correlation factor goes up to 97.6%. Extremely high correlations. Very rarely in economics do you get this sort of strong correlation. If you take into account the actual wage rate in every industry and divide the wage bill of every industry by the average wage in that industry, the correlation drops to a tiny extent. So there's a certain amount of noise generated by variations in wage rates, but still it's a massive correlation. And the results we got for Britain have been reproduced in country after country. Some of this work was done before us. Sheikh, Petrovic, and Ochoa all give values above 90%. The countries that have been studied include the USA, UK, Italy, Yugoslavia, Mexico, lots of different years, lots of different ways of computing the correlations. The pattern is stable. Everyone shows that prices track relative labor values. This is just a table of the techniques some people used. Sheikh used log linear regressions, and he did a whole bunch of countries. Petrovic did Yugoslavia, which is interesting because Yugoslavia, at the time he was preparing the statistics, wasn't a capitalist economy, but an economy of workers' cooperatives. And this showed that the same labor theory of value applies to them. And Ochoa did USA and Mexico. All of these things give extremely high correlations. Now, there have been two objections raised to this. When myself and Alan Cottrell were first talking about this at a conference in Lausanne about 1994 or so, some Italian economists said, well, that's just the naturalistic fallacy. Marx had the naturalistic fallacy of thinking that there was something natural which underlay value. It's entirely arbitrary, they said. You could as well choose electricity. Well, logically, you can choose electricity, but I'll show you that it doesn't work. The second argument, which is surprisingly has been put forward by some Marxist economists, is to say that the correlation that most Marxist economists have found is actually a spurious correlation caused by the different sizes of the industries. The spurious correlation argument says let's say the car industry value of output and its price are both big because it's a big industry, whereas the watch industry, if we had constructed stuff for the watch industry, was a small industry, so it'll have small value and small value of output. Well, the problem is, logically, how do you determine whether an industry is big or small? You determine if it's big if it employs a lot of people. So if it employs a lot of people, it uses a lot of labor, and therefore it's big in Marx's definition, and therefore the labor theory of values it determining it's having a big output, so it doesn't actually escape. But if size was an independent value, then you can empirically test this. As I say, the law of value is an empirical claim. It's not to do with morality, it's about what really happens. It doesn't say that labor ought to determine value. It says it actually is what determines value. It's a factual statement. It says this is the quantity which best predicts prices. Now, if we take a competing candidate like electricity, you can apply exactly the same maths using the input-output tables to determine the number of kilowatt hours required to produce the output of every industry. And that kind of thing is done now from the standpoint of carbon dioxide emission equivalents, for example. But when you do that, you find that it gives far less of a prediction. Here, I'm quoting coefficients of variation, which are the inverse of correlation things. If something's got a low coefficient of variation, it means it's got very little variability. So the coefficient of variation with respect to labour and price is very small, whereas the coefficient of variation for Britain between electricity and price is very large. Zachariah did the same thing for Sweden, again finds it's much larger. So empirically, no, it's not electricity. And electricity is the best of all the competing candidates. Okay, if you take steel input or rubber input or any of the other inputs available, you get even worse figures. So labor is special. It gives you a prediction which the other things don't give you. So electricity or energy isn't the substance of value empirically. It isn't what is being conserved in exchange. It's labor. And industry size doesn't explain it. Whoops, what's gone wrong? The last page is not showing. I should be able to get to it. Yeah, these are the papers I've been citing as empirical evidence for it. If you're concerned with the mathematical logic, it's in our book, Classical Econophysics. Okay.
Okay, so it's on me. The title of my talk is The Revolution of Money. Paul has presented the significance of Marx's labor theory of value, relating it on the one hand to Marx's own time and the industrial age, and on the other hand updating it for contemporary capitalism. My own interpretation of Marx's value theory or value critique comes from what is known as the German New Marx-Reading, die Neue Marx-Lektüre. This approach emerged in Germany in the period leading up to the pivotal year 1968 and developed a logical-categorical reading of capital, also referred to as form-analytical approach. Today, the best-known representative of this New Marx-Reading is Michael Heinrich. The pioneers at that time, however, were Hans-Georg Backhaus, Helmut Reichelt, Hans-Jürgen Krahl, Alfred Schmidt, and others, almost without exception students of Adorno. The interpretation of value was directed against two classical readings that dominated both camps. On the one hand, the mainstream bourgeois economic theory, and on the other hand, its great adversary, Marxism. The interpretation challenged, on the one hand, the objective labor theory of value found in the classical bourgeois economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo, a theory to which, according to traditional Marxism, Marx allegedly endorses, albeit critically. And on the other hand, the New Marx reading also opposed deriving value from commodity exchange and in some cases even from a presumed historical stage of simple commodity production. This was the approach taken primarily in critical theory and Western Marxism. The new logical-categorical reading of Marx, by contrast, approached Marx's analysis of the value form, and this is, in my view, its critical achievement, as a critique both of the objective labor theory of value and of simple commodity exchange. Value can therefore be derived neither from its presumed substance, labor, nor from its presumed form, commodity exchange and circulation. The New Marx reading initially brought these two critiques together in a critique of pre-monetary theories of value and of a pre-value commodity. So there can be no theory of value that does not first determine value in terms of money. In other words, there is no value and no substance and form of value before and without money. Money is the logical a priori for value, like the concept is for thinking. This was the major insight and breakthrough of the 1960s and 70s in the work of Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt, the pioneers of this kind of reading. From the 1990s onward, Michael Heinrich and a number of other authors then developed this critique further into what is called a monetary theory of value. But the central insight of this logical categorical reading was not only that there is no value without money, and that money is logically prior both to labor and to commodity. The central insight also was that for the very same reason, money on its part cannot be derived either substantively from labor or formally from commodity and commodities exchange and circulation, at least not without ending up in circular arguments. Money cannot be derived from a substance and a form that are constituted by money in the first place. But the problem, therefore, is that no satisfactory explanation has been provided for this genesis of money, and subsequently for the mediation of substance and form, labor and commodity. As correct as it is that money is decisive for the capitalist status of labor and the commodity as substance and form of one and the same social and specifically capitalist relation, the genesis and the status of money itself has remained underdetermined. And here comes in the radical, or rather revolutionary, new status of money that I want to show today. It is a revolution of money. In the revolution of money lies the actual capitalist revolution, a revolution that radically separates money from everything it might have been in pre-capitalist and non-capitalist societies. And if, in Marx's Critique of Political Economy, money and the relation of money to value and labor, hence to commodities and valorization, if this relation stands at the center, then this capitalist revolution must also be found in money's critique of political economy. Indeed, it must be found, it must stand at its very center. Then Marx's critique of political economy is, first and foremost, indeed a theory of a revolution, but not of an upcoming socialist revolution. It is rather a theory of the revolution that capitalism has already brought and in which we all live in. So the question then is, how do these two revolutions come together? The capitalist revolution of money on the one hand, and Marx's theory or critique of this revolution on the other. First of all, these two revolutions converge because Marx pursues an immanent critique in the tradition of the concept of critique developed by Kant and Hegel. Also, the immanent critique was a kind of revolution, a revolution in thinking brought about by the revolution of the society itself. And with this revolution in thinking, there was, precisely because it was conceptualized by Kant and Hegel as an immanent critique, an initial process of self-understanding of this capitalist revolution by philosophy. So we can say that these two revolutions, the capitalist revolution and the revolution in thinking, are in the end one and the same revolution. They only seem to be two different revolutions because philosophy and its immanent critique produced a kind of distortion and idealistic inversion of that capitalist revolution. German idealism was a revolution in thinking because it constituted only a pure philosophical self-interpretation, a pure philosophical processing and presentation of precisely this capitalist revolution. The immanence of the critique was an immanence that understood itself only in terms of thinking, reason, spirit, etc., and not in terms of money, value, labor, commodity form, capital, etc. Consequently, German idealism understood its immanent critique as a self-critique only of thought and reason, metaphysics and philosophy, and not as a kind of self-critique of capitalism. This is precisely where Marx intervened and introduced his materialist turn. Simply said, Marx takes up the philosophical self-understanding of capitalist society, or rather its misunderstanding, to turn it against itself, as it were. In fact, Marx even makes a double turn here. What regards the first turn, he makes a materialist turn of German idealism and especially of Hegelian dialectics and the concept of spirit. Marx shows that what appears in philosophy and especially in Hegel as standing on its head is in reality a social process. And what in philosophy was processed and developed in philosophical concepts and categories must be determined as a social and specifically capitalist process. A similar immanent critique is, as it's well known, undertaken by Marx with respect to economic theory and science. The bourgeois economic theory does indeed process capitalist economy and defines it not in philosophical, but in explicitly economic concepts and categories, yet it, like philosophy, naturalizes capitalism and ontologizes it as a kind of transhistorical rationality and necessity. So this is the first dimension or operation of this materialist turn. Marx's second turn consists in that bourgeois capitalist society has indeed revolutionized the old world, the feudal, agrarian, religious world, but the actual revolution is still to come. It is still to come, yet it is already immanent in bourgeois capitalist society and even prepared by it, but at the same time it is withheld and blocked by the very same capitalism. So immanent critique means also that capitalism itself must produce its own overcoming, immanently from within, with an inner necessity. Capitalism must be an immanent self-critique, even if this critique does not happen automatically, but precisely by its immanent contradictions and by class conflict, by social struggles and its subjects. In this sense, capitalism is not only a revolution of the old society, it also generates the necessity of its own revolutionary overcoming and abolition. And indeed, both critics and supporters of Marx alike have primarily understood revolution in relation to a socialist society that is immanent to capitalism, a revolution that is coming into being through capitalism and its contradictions. Moreover, Marx identified with the working class also a revolutionary subject with a historical mission. He identified a subject that is immanently rooted in the contradictions of capitalist society and in its historical development, whether crisis-ridden or progressive, but that also leads beyond this immanence. This theory of revolution, followed by the idea of a socialist planning of production, was perhaps the most important implication and consequence drawn from Marx's critique of political economy and from the labor theory of value as it was read by classical Marxism. Western Marxism, critical theory, and the new appropriations of Marx in the 1960s did not so much abandon this idea of revolution, they rather shifted the emphasis in a different direction, in the other direction, backwards, so to say. Because here, Marx appears first and foremost now as a revolutionary in the field of philosophy and of the political economy and science of his time. On this reading, Marx revolutionized the method of critique and presentation. In doing so, he did not yet establish a fully developed revolutionary theory or a socialist science, but he did in fact revolutionize bourgeois political economy as a science, as well as the philosophical self-understanding through which the bourgeois had understood itself. Already in 1923, the young Georg Lukács in History and Class Consciousness framed Marx's critique of the commodity form as a materialist turn within philosophy and bourgeois scientific rationality. Lukács understood this turn as the practical realization and overcoming of philosophy itself, famously imputed by him to the practice of the proletariat. In the mid-1960s, Louis Althusser then formulated his famous idea of a scientific revolution. According to Althusser, Marx achieved a scientific breakthrough in the field of political economy and a genuine scientific revolution. This revolution occurred through what Althusser called an epistemological break and through a new theoretical practice, a practice that resulted from the discovery of a new continent, the continent of historical materialism. For Althusser, however, this revolution does not consist, as it does for Lukács, in a materialist turn of Hegelian dialectics, but rather in a decisive break with that dialectics. Althusser located his scientific revolution in the critique of political economy, but explicitly not, here again different from Lukács, in the analysis of the commodity form or in the concept of value and money. Instead, he identified Marx's scientific revolution in the concept of surplus value. He even placed Marx's analysis of the value form as still within the tradition of that Hegelianism and that dialectics that he, Althusser, rejected. He associated the value form analysis with the early, still philosophical and anthropological Marx, from whom the later, mature Marx of Capital was said to have broken. For this reason, Althusser famously recommended skipping the opening of Capital with the analysis of its value form. It was precisely this gap opened up by Althusser that Michael Heinrich later occupied, drawing on Althusser, but also going beyond him. Heinrich located Marx's scientific breakthrough exactly in that value form analysis that Althusser regarded as compromised and advised readers to bypass. Heinrich understands Marx's scientific revolution as the development of a science of value, but one that advances a monetary theory of value. It is through this monetary theory of value, Heinrich argues, that Marx decisively broke with the labor theory of value found in both bourgeois economics and also in traditional socialist economic theory. In my view, however, the truly revolutionary character of money itself has not yet been fully grasped. More precisely, the scientific revolution that Althusser, Michael Heinrich and others attribute to Marx does not yet capture the specific revolution that Marx was able to identify within capitalism itself. Although the new Marx-Reading found out that money is decisive for the capitalist determination of labor and commodities, for the double character and for their status as the substance and the form of capitalist society, this new reading has not yet sufficiently explained the revolution that money itself underwent and through which it revolutionized both labor and commodity and our society as a whole. So how does this revolution brought about by money, or better by capitalist money, look like? The revolution consists first of all in that money and capitalism is radically separated and different from everything that money was in pre-capitalist and non-capitalist societies. As a result, capitalist money operates with a totally different logic or technique. Only this radical new, this capitalist determination of money also explains why labor and commodities in capitalism are fundamentally different from what they were in pre-capitalist and non-capitalist society. They acquire a double character through which they became moments of a valorization and receive a specifically capitalist status and determination. I will limit myself to outline only 3 key points of this revolution. The first point regards the new status in general. What is revolutionary is that money and capitalism performs a quantification through measure and through measurement. This technique of quantification regards all of money's distinct functions. All its main functions, first as a measure of value, second as a means of realizing, mediating and preserving value, and third as the capitalist self-relation of money in the form of the valorization of value. All these functions taken together form a proper technique the technique of quantification through measurement. Through this measurement, both the quantified relations and the quantitative itself acquire an entirely new and historically unprecedented status. Because what exactly does money measure and quantify in capitalist society, and only in capitalist society? Money does not quantify labor or commodity as such. That is merely a necessary semblance, a shine on the surface of our society. What money actually quantifies is the relation between producers and their means of production and reproduction. In capitalism, both producers and means of production assume, through their radical separation and their simultaneously quantitative valorization, executed in the process of so-called primitive or original accumulation, both producers and means of production assume a historically new form. According to Marx, producers become labor power as a commodity, and means of production become capital. So in capitalism, money quantifies these forms of labor and capital by subjecting their valorization and their products to measurement. Through this process of measurement, money determines the productive power contained within this valorization. It determines decisive magnitudes from this productive power, magnitudes decisive for the very same process, for the very same productive valorization they came from. This measurement is incredibly productive because between the measuring money and the valorization being measured, a reflexive relationship emerges. Measurement does not simply record value, it rather feeds back into the very process it measures and thereby shapes it and forces its permanent development or even its permanent revolution. Maybe that's the ultimate capitalist revolution Marx developed. The crucial point of this reflexivity, however, is not only the reflexivity between the measuring money and the measured values. The crucial point lies in a second reflexivity, namely in money's capitalist self-relation. In the values of commodities, money determines those magnitudes that are decisive for its own valorization as capital. More precise, money measures in the commodities produced what its own externalization into the commons of their production has been worth. And after these values have been realized, money externalizes and transforms these values again into those components. Put sharply, money measures by its capital form itself. Okay, so much for the first point. The second point I would like to emphasize is a substance that emerges out of this measuring process, the substance that Marx calls abstract labor. This substance is not a substance in a physical sense. The substance is rather temporal. More precisely, the substance is constituted through a seemingly quantified time, a time that money claims as the measure of valorization and of the productive power of its two components, labor and capital. So what is being quantified through measurement and what builds the substance of value, this negative, empirically pure and universal quality that has caused so much theoretical difficulty, this ghostly substance is formed through the quantification of the relation between labor and capital, and that relation is a temporal relation. It is even a double temporal it is even a double time relation, namely, in Marx terms, the relation between living and dead labor time and the relation between necessary and surplus labor time. These two temporal relations must, on the one hand, take on qualitative forms in labor and capital. They become effective only if labor and capital embody living and dead labor time, and if they literally and in the strong sense give time a qualitative form. On the other hand, money must give this time in the same strong sense a formless, purely quantitative existence and expression, and in doing so, money produces this peculiar, almost ghostly substance of value. So the true substance of value, the very being of capitalist society, is temporal, and likewise the essence of money is temporal as well. However, the nature of this time is ambivalent because time is both a natural and at once a social phenomenon. On the one hand, through money, we invoke a physical time as the measure of valorization. This time appears to be given by nature, namely the homogeneous, abstract physical time of modern natural science. This time is given by nature, but we can take it only by money. Labor, capital, and commodities are, through the various functions of money and through its movement as capital, subjected to this temporal measure, to this natural time itself. Thereby, the seemingly natural time becomes socialized by our social relations, by their quantifications, and by their measurement. Our social relations are measured against this time, they are divided into magnitudes, they are objectified and quantified, and by this, our relations are paradoxically socialized by a natural physical time. But at the same time, our social relations are naturalized by this time. Their quantification and objectification by this time appears naturalized as our second nature. In this way, time itself appears as both, as a socially constituted time and as a naturalized time. And money is a dividing element for this double character, the interface of both times, as it presents undecidable both a natural time and a socialized time. The relation between money and value, or more precisely between capital and valorization, must therefore be understood not only as a process of society's self-measurement. This measurement must also be translated into an economy of time, as Marx famously writes in the Grundrisse, economy of time. To this, all economy ultimately reduces itself. The third and last point I would like to raise, alongside the technique of quantification through measurement and the economy of time, follows from these two considerations. Through the technique of quantification by measurement, we become able to literally calculate with the temporal relations that arise from it. We can deal with time rationally and productively, and ultimately we can reckon and calculate with the identity of time itself, as well as with society's temporal self-relation. This calculability of time constitutes, I would argue, the generally capitalist determination and the interconnection between money and value. The productive use of time marks the real beginning of the capitalist mode of production, or perhaps its constant beginning with itself, its permanent revolution. It is a moment in which capitalism enters its own cycle of reproduction, the cycle in which labor power and capital in all their forms become two elements of a temporal relation that is at once a quantitative valorization. In short, and to conclude, the true revolution of money lies in this quantitative calculation with time. It is this revolution that opened up a new time and a new temporal order, and with it a new historical epoch, the epoch we call capitalism. Thanks.
Does it work? Okay, it does. Okay. First of all, thanks for this invitation. Really honored about it. I will speak today about use value. And in my book, which you didn't mention, but it was published 5 years ago, I researched surplus value and non-surplus value as it was posited in the socialist background. And at this moment, I'm interested precisely not in surplus value, but in use value. What is use value for Marx? It is the value that is only fitting the produced object, and it is not participating in the exchange. So when a baker bakes the bread, when the tailor makes a table and makes it for one's use. So on the one hand, this is something utilitarian, and along with exchange value and surplus value, Marx is always saying that use value is something that is ignored in exchange value because things become abstractions and they cannot posit and reveal their use. And we can look at it as a utilitarian issue. Well, we produce something and they have the use. But the socialist philosopher whom I'm researching for years now, Evald Ilyenkov, who, by the way, wrote a very important text, Dialectics of Abstract and the Concrete in Marxist Capital, written in 1962, which was highly appreciated by Louis Althusser, and Louis Althusser even wrote him and admired this book and was teaching it. So he is saying that use value and the positing and such a focus of Marx on use value is not simply an economic issue or the issue of socialism, that socialist society will be based only on use value, not on exchange and not on surplus. So this surplus will not simply be functioning in the use value because we shall be producing the objects without circulating and converted forms. But he's saying that something more important, more philosophical is happening in the object based on the use value. And Marx is, to a certain extent, on the one hand saying in his thesis of Feuerbach that we return to praxis, we return to empirical reality, but on the other hand, precisely the use value is achieving something that philosophy was trying to achieve for years. It is actually able to connect meta-objecthood with the concept, because the concept is not anymore detached from the objecthood, and the concept is fitting its signified, the matter, the objecthood, and in this way, the simple objects which in exchange production or in capitalist exchange, they are simple abstractions, they are fetishes, they are commodities. Without commodifying logic, without commodifying system, they acquire what even Plato was aspiring for, when the objecthood acquires idea. So the object becomes enlightened, it becomes ideated, and in this way, Marx, doing economy and insisting on economy, is continuing to do epistemology, philosophic epistemology, and reconsidering philosophic epistemology. That's why Ilyenkov's point in this work was that Marx is a great philosophical epistemologist. But my next question was, okay, when we speak about use value, we know that this utopia of Marx about society, which only applies use value, never been realized. If we look at the socialist context, the reason why we usually assess that the socialist societies did not sustain is that they had too much deviations of socialism, deviations of the system, corruption, etc., etc. But my question was the following: what if the failures of the socialist society, and I myself come from the socialist society and I lived for quite a time in it to have this practical observation, what if the failure of socialism is not due to deviation from the logic of use value and deviation from socialism, but what if this inevitable failure is already in the use value theory? So there is something in the use value, and there is something in socialism, and there is something in communism which is unimplementable, unimplementable. And what is this issue? And I think maybe Marx himself and Ilyenkov, in addition, might give us some direction in our attempt to unravel this riddle. Now, as I think Frank already mentioned, it's very interesting, and Ilyenkov pays attention to this, that when Marx tries to speak about surplus value, how is it that this surplus appears? Well, we can think that there is the logic of surplus value, that somebody is adding money, and of course all those who have read Marx, we know that price addition is not surplus value addition, it's completely different realia. But we imagine this surplus as something, some evil of capitalist society which adds money, like the owner who wants to sell things more as more precious items. But Marx discovers that already on the level of pre-monetary exchange, the surplus is implied. And when he wants to find a universalizing logic, to find how surplus works, he's not simply describing various forms of value, commodity, capital, rent, interest, but he focuses on this non-monetary exchange of things and says an almost a radical thing, that even on the level of elementary exchange, I give you a my pen and you give me a book, and we exchange things. Already on this very primitive exchange, the use value is not possible. So use value is something that should only be created for its application, for its use, for its meaning. Whereas when I exchange thing, I want to use the thing that I hold as some sort of equivalent, so as some kind of relative value. And in this sense, it on the one hand has use value, but on the other hand, it is already endowed with this relativity of its own equivalence. So it's not a thing anymore. It's not a thing that has the meaning and has the objecthood, but it is the equivalence. This fosters and triggers him to say in Gotha program, from each according to one's ability, to each according to one's need, that only in such society the use value will be applicable. And I think this is one of the most radical demands from a society, and we shall find out why. Now, a little bit, I shift to Ilyenkov's piece. Where he speaks, he tries to justify socialist system. Because, I mean, the main rebuke to socialist system is that, well, socialist system never had use value. So it was not a real socialism, the more so that it wasn't a real communism. It was still reproducing the possibility of surplus. It has a waged labor, etc., etc. And nevertheless, Ilyenkov says that although socialism is not deprived completely of value, it has not established use value and only use value as such. It applies money, it applies waged labor, it applies exchange and trade as well. Still, as he says, in socialism, this is a society, although at the initial stage in the form of representative state organs, which acquires the possibility of looking at the movement of use value with open eyes and not through the inverting glasses of the value form, where the individual links of divided labor are independent of each other. So what is important here, that socialist society provides the opportunity to link all those artels, or to link all those working community and create one system, one labor system. And in this sense, he is right. It's not the separate proprietor who is selling one item to another proprietor, which is totally sovereign, but the whole socialist system was one big meta system. And in that sense, he was, of course, right. Moreover, the socialist wage was more like a basic need, and it functioned so that the items produced were not commodities. They were not gathering the surplus. And the main thing that I focused on in my book, the reason why they were not commodities, they were not attractive. They did not trigger desire. And this is the title of my book, Practicing the Good Desire and Boredom in Soviet Socialism. Now, let's go further, and this statement was made by Ilyenkov in 1965, and these are the socialist shoes. Just for you to look at the non-attractive, non-libidinal
item. This is my book. And yeah, so in 3 years later, in 1968, Ilyenkov writes the letter to Yuri Zhdanov, a cybernetician, where he claims that maybe the fact that socialist production is not able to produce commodity, and everyone desires commodity. Maybe it's a terrible coercion, and all the socialist societies, they created shadow markets. So the existence of shadow market alongside with the society which insists constantly on use value. And the more you insist on the use value, the more the society creates its own underworld. And this underworld is the criminalized capitalist shadow economy underworld. So maybe this is why something is wrong in the use value. And Ilyenkov writes to Zhdanov, the only correct thing would be to say within this and these limits, we don't want anymore to produce this abstractly general logic of use value, and maybe let's make a concession to the market logic. Let the laws of market prevail with all their disadvantages. And this is an impossible thing for Ilyenkov, which was a totally obsessed communist. And consequently, my question, what if precisely the subjection of political economy to the use value economy, and hence to this ideated character of objecthood featured in Marx or Ilyenkov, entails the production of such objects which fulfill their social, epistemic, and even emancipatory function, the objects which are these eidoses, right? But ultimately represent poverty and squalor. And this is really a paradox that the capitalist society creates comfortable and attractive objects, whereas the society of justice creates objects that are squalid, miserable. So now I would dwell about the appeal of lots of researchers who were dwelling on socialist planning, and we mentioned socialist planning today. Someone says, well, socialist planning was crap from the outset, and I would agree with Paul that there were very important grains in socialist planning, but generally when the researchers try to assess and speak about why socialist planning failed, they say that there were corruption, there were deviation, there was inefficiency, and one of the main things, there was a great computation project which was called OGAS, which was conceived by Kitov, then developed by Viktor Glushkov, and it started from end of 50s and developed up to 70s. What is OGAS? It's a National Automated System of Accounting and Information. The application and establishment of which was discussed during 10 years. And lots of researchers say, well, if they accepted the system, and I will not dwell today why they didn't accept, there are 7 or 8 reasons of why they thwarted this system ultimately, and maybe if they did, Russia or former socialist states would be today as efficient as China and as technically equipped as Japan. But nevertheless, I mean, the explanation is that, oh, such a pity they did not do it, and therefore there was no post-industrial leap, and therefore it lagged behind in terms of technical development. But My question is that actually, yes, they did not accept this system, but there is one thing that the computation would not change. Computation would not change the fact that use value forbids exchange, and that use value, so the problem with the planned economy was not in that it still relied on the capitalist function of value more than a socialist state had to, but that it adhered to use value too much. So again, the failure of the socialist system is not because it was capitalist, but because it was too much socialist and therefore created capitalist shadows. Thus, the shadow economy deviations of quasi-capitalist character amidst historical socialism's focus on use-value economics were inevitable, as the latter use-value economic was experienced as unsustainable in the context of supply and demand logic. So when we speak supply and demand, use-value doesn't provide demand. And there is this contradiction already in Marx. When he says, from each according to one's ability to each according to one's need. And this is the premise of communist society, at the same time insisting on use value which forbids exchange, then how the need will be implemented. Using goods according to one's need presupposes affluence and prosperity reached by productive forces, whereas use-value economy, when it bans exchange and hence interest, motivation and trade, might inevitably lead to slowdowns, and it led to slowdowns. So the socialist slowdown wasn't because of deviation from socialism or because of corruption, but because the socialist condition of use-value slows down. Well, there are reasons for that, and we can discuss it in discussion, but there is the growth of productive forces and consequently to limitations in supply of goods and of quality in production, which brings the whole system to halt. And of course, what I am speaking about today is an assumption, but it is a very realistic assumption also due to research of many other socialist economists who tried in the 70s and 80s, discussing this with the Politburo, how could we shift to producing things which would be viable, which would be attractive, which would somehow really supply the demand of people and would fit the demand of people. And the problem was not the shortage of goods in socialist production, but that they did not fit the demand of the population. So what is the problem? The problem is that use value produces precisely this philosophic object, the tableness of table, the codeness of code, the thingness of a thing, without gradation of quality, without gradation of priority, and even forbidding this priority and forbidding this differentiation. So I would end here and yeah.
Thanks, Keti. Thank you, everybody. These were brilliant 3 presentations. I was really following very closely, and it's intense. It was intense, really, to retain everything and to shift to different perspectives. I guess we can open the floor for discussion, but do you want before that to exchange some comments among yourselves? Yeah. Later? Okay, so any questions?
If you want, or you can just speak.
Yeah, we'll share one of the microphones. Yeah. Yeah.
Can everybody hear?
You can have.
Okay.
We're recording, so it's best. To...
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, to Mr. Paul, I wanted to ask, just to maybe test conceptually the idea of the proportionality of labor and value. What do you think is more valuable, a farm that autonomously produces food or a farm that produces food using the value of people? And if you say the farmer is invested with prior forms of labor, then what about a farm that autonomously produces food that was itself produced autonomously, and then also maybe allow, like all the way in the future, the autonomous farm has been running long enough that farms that are not autonomous have built up a bigger amount of labor, if that makes sense. So it has consumed yeah. That's my question.
Okay, yeah. If suppose we start out from what you assume, which is the farm is autonomous, you then have to ask, what is the farm doing with its output? The assumption of talking about value and exchange value is that it's going to sell its output, okay? Exchange it for something else. But as soon as you say that, you're acknowledging the farm isn't itself autonomous. It is consuming products produced elsewhere. So when you're talking about the autonomous farm, you're talking about the primitive village commune that didn't engage in commodity exchange, that was a self-sufficient community that Marx describes as the Indian communities under the Asiatic mode of production. So the concept of value as general social labor doesn't apply in that case, because that village is not part of a general social distribution of labor. You only have a within the village distribution of labor. And there's no commodity exchange occurring. Now, you may want to say how much time is being spent by the villagers ploughing, how much time is being spent reaping, how much time is being spent sowing. But those are just shares of the villagers' time. There's no value in the sense of exchange value coming into that.
Yes, you first. Yes, thanks. I was wondering about maybe the elephant in the room, which is Marxism. When I heard the talks, it was a little bit like this famous story with the people touching the elephant from different sides, right? So my question is, how do you each make sense of each other's talks? Because it seems to me that they are totally incompatible. My question would be, and the second question would be then, if this shows that Marxism is just a kind of study object of, I don't know, some kind of academic subdiscipline or hobby horse, because let's say, integrating framework were totally absent in all of your talks. Each of you have given your interpretation, often quite unhistorically, but correctly repeating some other authorities on what Marxism is, or what Marx did or not did. So I'm wondering a bit. I don't know about the other people here, but I mean, I was not coming to hear a specialist talk on, value theory. I can read this up, like this is not very important. So I would suggest that you comment on each of your talks and that we can have a more open discussion about what's going on with Marxism. Otherwise, we end up in this kind of Britpop Marxism. They claiming, okay, the UK is leading now the Marxist discussion. It's a little bit ridiculous.
It's on.
No, it's not on because there is no light. Okay, boss. Okay, no, I just wanted to pick up the mic so that I ask you which one of you would like to respond to this question. I'm not a presenter, I'm a moderator. Because you're kind of moderating this discussion, maybe I can counter-moderate and give my feedback. I don't see any reason why within a certain tradition of thought there should be, I don't know, complete alignment of different interpreters. So that would be, in fact, the richness of this encounter and exchange rather than its poverty or shortcoming. This is my view. The speakers will respond on their behalf. And I can say that these are one of the real Marxists who rely almost not at all or very little on other interpreters. I've written a book with Paul. I've worked with Frank. I know Keti's work. Okay, she was discussing an interpreter of Marx. Yes, Ilyenkov. But aside from my knowledge of their work, it was evident in their presentations that they were simply discussing source material primarily. So this is my counter-moderating comment. I will give it now to...
Yeah, no, in a way I agree. This is why it was called Marxism from nowhere. So it was not presenting three people saying the same. But the thing is, different Marxisms exist, so at least it's start to bring these different Marxisms together. But I agree that I don't know if they're even contradictory to each other, but they're focused at least on different perspective. That's at least for sure. But I also see it. We have to turn a problem that exists outside this room into a strength and bring at least different perspectives together, like we did in the first panel with 3 different feminisms, and we will probably do in the third panel when we talk about AI.
Well, thanks for this question. Well, to a certain extent, this is definitely true, and we have a little bit, this empirical British Marxism, Russian Soviet Marxism, and German Michael Heinrich Marxism. So to a certain extent, a supermarket of Marxisms. But maybe we could take it easily a little bit, the more so that to really reconnect ourselves in some kind of common discussion. Marx is such a big issue that we would need a conference. And I would say that for me, it's always interesting to bump into theories presented today by Paul, for instance, which insists on the absolute translatability of natural science and hard sciences into social sciences. For me, this is extremely difficult, and and frustrating also. But frustration is also quite invigorating.
Is that working? Yeah. I'm giving a talk here on a very technical topic, which is the value form analysis. And the reason I'm doing it is that it fits into the book that Katarina and I recently wrote on defending materialism. which is Defending Marx as a Mechanical Materialist, and the extent to which Marxism depends on concepts both from the classical materialists like Lucretius and the Enlightenment Lucretians like Newton. The extent to which these ideas percolate through Marx in a way which is not immediately apparent to people if they're not familiar with the history of science. Now, this is just one topic. When we come to the topics that Keti has been talking about, in this book, How the World Works, or Was die Welt am Laufen hält, the last 2 or 3 chapters are devoted to the topics Keti's been talking about, and price theory, use value, labor value in the socialist economies, and why, for example, there's a big contrast between price and value theory applied in Bulgaria and Poland. And why did Bulgaria not have the food riots that Poland had? It's because the complete failure of the Polish government to apply in any way the Marxist theory of value.
But you speak about mechanistic interpretation of Marx, right? And I speak about dialectical and ideological interpretation. So these are really different aspects. And Frank speaks about logical-categorial. So really different aspects. And Ilyenkov even has the book criticizing this mechanistic approach because he was regarding it as a positivist approach, which was already criticized by Lenin. But it's also a drama of Marx, right? So we need this concatenation of various attitudes.
Okay, 2 short remarks. One on use value. The loaf of bread you see in front or behind the window of a bakery has 2 different use values, depending on whom it belongs and who it wants. It belongs to the bakery. The use value is that it is rare capitalism. The baker cannot bite into the loaf of bread. It will use his value immediately. He can't sell it. And only in the transformation, when the loaf of bread is changing hands from the baker to the consumer, the potential of the bread, and there I go with Paul, the potential remains the same. But use value is dependent on whom something or what something belongs to whom. It is a social affair, not a material. Number 2, that is a question that is going to Frank because he is connected with that kind of thinking, and it goes to you because you're an empirist. We live in a world, and that is what you were talking about. Where is the relation of these 3 talks to what we will go into, what is going on in the world? And in this world, and this, well, you're all young people, that is right in front of you. They're printing money like hell, putting up credits like hell. And everybody believes that this credit has value, and it is not related on human labor. Where will that go to? This is the chair which is gone out of the ass by themselves. We do not need to do anything. This is a story which comes to an end from itself. This is my opinion on that. And where is human labor going? The mass of human labor, of productive labor, of abstract labor, abstrakte Arbeit by Marx, is diminishing in the world. Yeah, well, okay, you say no, because not every labor that is exchanged into money is productive labor. You conclude on that. Okay, I just wanted to give a direction.
Okay. I'm afraid I've been so fixated on the last question, the last point you made, that I've forgotten the first one. On whether the amount of productive labour is going down or up, it's certainly going up because of the rapid industrialization of Asia. The number of people engaged in machine industry, mass production of physical goods is rising at a rate that's never happened before. So it's going up. Now, if you look at European countries, it's gone down, and that going, or if you look at the United States, it's gone down. How has that been achieved? It's been achieved by the fact that the dollar is a universal world currency, and the United States can print as much of them as you like, as it wants, as you say. But how long can that system be sustained? The financiers may believe that money is just created by writing a credit line, but the strategists in the Pentagon know that's not the case. They know that the power to issue dollars depends on the ability of the United States military to actually command physical resources in the world. And what's happening since the start of the year is a systematic process by which the military in the United States is taking command of the world's resources, taking command of the physical resources upon which productive labor depends, with the aim, since they have been unable to revolutionize and modernize their own production, with the aim of preventing Chinese industrial production moving forward. That is why Venezuela had the unprecedented situation of its head of state being kidnapped, and then the start of this month, the unprecedented situation of the assassination of the head of state of Iran. The capitalist system is no longer working by means of equivalent exchange. It's now working by raw brute force.
Oh, you can start if you want. Yeah. No, I think it was a little bit the question of the upcoming crisis, and I agree the two main components of a capitalist crisis is too much money without productive valorization and too much labor forces without productive valorization. But it's interesting that only capitalism has this quandary that it gets into crisis not if because it's too poor, but it becomes too rich. And it's exactly these two overproduction of surplus population and overproduction of credit money, financial forms of money, which brings capitalism into crisis, which is a totally radical new form of crisis. And so I can a little bit come back to my thesis that so capitalism started a revolution which everything turns upside down. So in former societies, there were a crisis when there was not enough forms of wealth. So I don't know, harvesting was wrong, there was an epidemic, there was, I don't know, a war going on. And we in capitalism have the problem that capitalism gets into crisis if it has too much of its two main components to produce wealth, too much labor forces without productive use of it, and too much forms of wealth and forms of credit, financial forms, also classical forms of capitalist production like industries or bakeries. And so the connection doesn't work well. And I think, of course, if this is the mother of all crises, then the other crises come. Then comes these Fortsetzung der Ökonomie mit anderen Mitteln. So the war in Iran and all these wars going on, all the ideological crisis, all the culture wars has of course to do with the overproduction of the two components of capitalist mode of production. Labor forces on the one hand and capital in all its forms on the other hand, who does not find a situation like they had in these 20 years in only a part of the world, in only these particular conditions after two devastating wars in the 60s and in the 70s.
Well, just a small remark concerning the labor, and you spoke about labor time and surplus produced by this added labor. This point of Marx was always a little bit incomprehensible for me. Also because I was reading a lot of post-structuralist thinkers, but also when I returned to what was happening during pandemic and when those virtual commodities appeared, which are not connected with the production of any labor or any production at all, and acquiring immediately an enormous symbolic value. So it's not only a surplus value, but just boosted symbolic value. So I was thinking that can we allege, and I have this allegation in myself also when I was reading Ilyenkov's Abstract and Concrete, that they underestimated something that later thinkers like Baudrillard, like Lyotard, like Deleuze found out in ourselves. So not in proprietor who exploits the worker, but in the worker himself, who is fascinated and who lives in this fascinated condition. And I think that Marx writes about this fascination by capitalism and fascination by commodity production in the economic philosophic manuscripts and later in Capital. But it's very important that Marx's strategy is not to describe this fascination itself, but to unravel it. He wants to go to reality. That's why he shows us the labor structure. But the fascination will not disappear from this explanation. And this is the problem that Marx himself has. So he does not explain this augmented condition of fascination, which is not confined to the proprietor or owner, but which in contemporary capital, financial capital, or I don't know, post-contemporary capital is rooted in each of us as a dream, as a phantasmatic nature of the production itself.
I think I have the mic now for the questions. And I have a question to Paul Cockshott. If I understood it correctly, you said in the context of the value price calculation and the problems that come with that, that in about 1920s in Russia, there was this publication of input-output tables. And I understood it like you would say there the problem was kind of solved of the price labor value calculation, how to transform it into each other. And in this context, I also wanted to ask you what you think about the MELT concept, monetary expression of labor time, and if you can give us your slides also.
I've distributed them to SMR so that they can... Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, we will upload them.
The slides are distributed to SMR so they can be uploaded, okay? I didn't say that in the 1920s they'd actually developed proper input-output tables. There were some steps towards it, and Keynes in the general theory remarks that he's seen some early drafts of this, and he's very impressed by how useful these are. The actual full development of them didn't come until Leontiev moved to the United States, and his first practical input-output table was for the USA, I think, for 1948. And really, you couldn't do them until you had computers to do the calculations. Trying to do it with hand calculation would have been impractical. And also, whilst we have these tables, the Bureau of Economic Affairs in the United States publishes them to, I think, 4 levels of digit precision, that is to say, to 10,000 different sectors. And you can use these to work out how much labor went into each sector of the US economy. That is still far below the number of products that actually exist in the economy. If you look at something like Alibaba and the number of products that Jack Ma's system handles, it is between 10 and 100 million. That's of the sort of order. So the level of analysis that's being carried out in the US Bureau of Economic Affairs is way below what Alibaba's doing. It's way below what could be done for the Chinese economy. You know roughly the number of products that is plausible for the Chinese economy. You know that they've got a workforce of maybe 600 million people. And you know that any product requires several people usually to do it. So you know that the number of products is going to be of the order of 100 million. So they're capable of handling that with Chinese data centers. But having that data doesn't mean that China is actually working using labor values. Jack Ma proposed doing that. He suggested now we can get rid of the monetary economy and do everything in labor values, but he was squashed on by the Communist Party Central Committee for that. That went beyond what they're willing to do. Technically, he was saying we can do it. Doesn't mean that it can be done directly, because there's all sorts of social implications if you actually shift to what Marx says in the Gotha program. And I'm not talking about to each according to his ability. I'm talking about the first step he's talking about, paying everyone in terms of labor time. It has huge implications for the whole tax system of a socialist country. If you take the Soviet Union, most of its revenue came from a turnover tax, which was essentially a form of surplus value. So it was essentially the profits of nationalized industry were used as state revenue and which were then used to subsidize all sorts of free services. But that's not what Marx talks about. He talks about having people paid the number of hours that they worked, and then they're charged an income tax. Now, that's quite a different system from what the Soviet Union operated. And it's very attractive to someone like North Korea to say we don't charge people any tax. No income tax in North Korea. But in fact, there is value-added tax, Mehrwertsteuer, in the form of a turnover tax in North Korean industry. So it hides the real social relations when they do that.
Okay. Yeah. I had the microphone. Okay.
That one was first, I believe, right?
No, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I was going to make 2 questions, more challenges to the presentations. First one is for Paul. I think there's a problem with the view of Marx system as a sort of like, or with the analogy with the thermodynamic. And I think it is that Marx didn't thought of value as labor time, but as necessary labor time, socially necessary labor time. I think that is important because, like, if you look at like first book, okay, fair enough, you can like think about these relations as static, but then in book 3 or in book 2 already, like you see how the issue of like socially necessary labor time actually degrades constantly the value of things that are being produced. So actually, like like you can produce, for example, in the problem of fixed capital, like you can produce a machine that like lose its values completely because of like technological revolutions, right? So then, I think, and I think this is important because like all the examples that you provided on empirical like analysis came from like industrialized economies. It would be interesting to like see those measurements in economies that have collapsed because like this kind of like technological revolution, right? So that kind of like fall into like inflation crisis, etc. Right? I don't know. I think in Venezuela, Iran, Argentina, right? So yeah, I think in the end, like the view is kind of Ricardian. Yeah, in the last presentation, like what I was going to say was basically taken by Paul, so I would not redundant it. I just think, yeah, there's indeed value relation like in real socialism too. I would just comment on something that you said, like in the end, AI and digital commodities are very labor intensive. Like the idea that they are just like imaginary objects that like that's just not true. They are actually more labor intensive than like than agriculture. Yeah, so it's just an illusion.
Marx says that himself. It's a redistribution of labor from different Bereiche, from different fields, definitely.
Okay. When you're doing the statistics, okay, the input-out tables are flow tables, okay? They therefore include the real depreciation of fixed capital, because what they record is the replacement purchases necessary to maintain the fixed capital stock plus any accumulation of new fixed capital. Now, you can't expect the correlation between price and value to be exact because the actual snapshot that's taken of the United States economy is not an economy undergoing simple reproduction. If it's done in some years, it's an economy that is undergoing contraction, where it's not replacing the capital stock. In other years, it's an economy which is replacing more capital stock than is being worn up. So therefore, the figures you get, the amount of indirect and direct labor required using annual input-output tables are snapshots, and they're not necessarily, they don't correspond to the abstract idea of it, because they're snapshots taken in the process of the business cycle. And depending on the position of the business cycle, they underestimate or overestimate the amount of labor that goes into things. In some points of the business cycle, when at the moment there will be huge quantities of capital equipment going into building data centers, okay? And the amount of actual value added that's being returned from these data centers will be disproportionately small because the snapshot is being taken at the point where there is a boom of investment in data centers. And that means that the flows shown in the input-output tables won't correspond realistically to exact reproduction conditions. And you can only really get exact figures if you're running a planned economy and you can disaggregate the planned accumulation from a planned simple reproduction, which can in principle be done when you're doing that. If you're getting statistics which are collected by the US Bureau of Economic Affairs, You can't do that. You're taking snapshots of a capitalist economy, which is a fluctuating system.
And may I ask you a question back? You said that AI works nonetheless than a worker, right?
No, I just said that producing AI, producing video games, or
Definitely, yeah.
commodities is actually more labor intensive.
Sure, that's clear. But tell me, what kind of labor is invested when the artist Maurizio Cattelan puts a banana with the scotch, and it costs $1 million? Where is the labor here?
I mean, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of labor there. I mean, you have a whole like cultural. I mean,
this is the idea of Didrik Didriksen, who says that surplus value in art, which is an enormous surplus value, unimaginable surplus value, which never existed in any production, that it exists due to lots and lots of institutions that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are two factors there. One is the existence of monopoly rents, which is like a completely different topic, which applies to art and sort of unique objects. And the other one is, I would say, like the whole labor put in the cultural industry that makes this kind of auction possible. But yeah, I would say like the issue there is like there are actually like surplus transfer between branches due to like monopoly rents.
So my question is it only labor, or we underestimate some other elements in this pricing and in this surplus production? Okay, this is a question.
Okay. Should I answer? Okay.
No, just a question in the air.
I also go.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. I was also, like others, a little bit wondering about the empirical strategy. I think it's quite compelling that that labor seems to be the most important factor of production. However, like to me, it seems the main debate or the most widespread alternative theory is marginal utility, right? And I was wondering, since of course you can explain both, like you can explain the labor as an equilibrium outcome and the other way around, if we would need an empirical strategy looking at shocks in only one of those two cases to actually test it, if marginal utility or labor is actually the price driver. And a second related question, having worked with input-output tables myself, like they rely on the Leontief production function, right? Which means that two inputs are perfect. Like you always need the same relation of two input factors, which was necessary to make those tractables. But to some degree, you prove the linearity because it's the assumption of the model of an input-output table underlying it. So I was wondering if input-output tables are necessarily the right model to test if this is really linear. Yeah.
Okay. The linearity would exist whether you're taking labor input or electricity input. Okay? Because of the structure of the matrix. The property of them is that in fact it's labor, not electricity, that determines the value. Now, as to marginal utility, this is something entirely subjective and unmeasurable. There is no way you can say what would be the price in the price structure of the outputs of the main 100 industries in Germany if marginal utility theory applied. There is no operationalizability of marginal utility theory there. You cannot measure the marginal utility of the German population. It is inherently said to be something subjective to each individual. All you can observe is the actual sales. But that's the starting point that you're wanting to measure. It's an idealist theory deliberately constructed as an idealist theory which can never be materially or operationally measured?
Okay, there was somebody there in the middle, but he will be out.
I think he has a last question.
Oh, okay.
Oh. I have rather two basic questions. The first one I would like to pose for Katie and Frank. I would just depart from the idea that money is an event, that money produced or is the product of a revolution. Then I was wondering, did this revolution do something with the value use? Can we talk about value use in the same manner, considering capitalist value use and just value use as a property of things or of thinghood? And the second question was, I was wondering how to tackle on the idea, and that goes for Paul, to how to deal with the problem of appearances from this phenomenologic approach. How can we deal with it and not be trapped in it? I was just wondering, I couldn't find anything in my head. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Your question was partly for Frank, partly for me. So the question is it value only for capitalism, or it can exist without capitalism, right?
In a way, what difference does it make to be value in capitalism and outside it?
Outside it.
Yeah, use value, I mean, not...
Yes. Actually, there is a very systemic clarity here. For Marx and for the theory, value is something that characterizes capital. And use value is an oxymoron. So use value is something that is not value. So when socialist production is accused in being capitalist, it is accused in still having value. So in certain sense, value is something that characterizes capitalist production. And communist production would exist in only the use. So. And that's why my question was whether it's at all implementable in human society and in relations within the human society, whether human society can get rid of exchange, because value is created by exchange.
No, value is created in production. Nowhere.
No, definitely value is created in production, yes. But exchange value is something that exists in exchange, right? And this is the Marxist point, which abstracts.
Don't let's start these whole value. But I try to concentrate and be short on the question of use value. I would strongly argue that use value in capitalism is something totally different from whatever use value might have been in pre-capitalist society. And not only the use value of a commodity like a smartphone or a car, but I think the more interesting question for me is a particular use value of the commodity labor power, of the means of production, and of money itself. And these use values are all three mainly temporal, I would suggest. So if you take, for example, a machine in pre-capitalist society was either a machine for joy, just for contemplative enjoyment, or it was a war machine. So it was in both cases not really a productive machine. A machine in capitalism is a machine to reduce necessary labor time to convert it in surplus labor time. This is something totally specific only for a capitalist machine. And this is also the question if we can use the use value of a capitalist machine for a socialist production when these temporal relation between necessary and surplus labor time and dead and living labor time is something specific only to capitalism. And this is for me so the interesting question, because on the one hand, the use value of the capitalist mode of production is that necessary labor time gets enormously reduced, and on the same time gets enormously spatialized in all these amounts of commodities. On the other hand, this way, this mode of production is specific to capitalism only, and I don't know if we can use these enormous productivity we have on the one hand in capitalist means of production and on the other hand of commodifying labor time, also in a communist or a socialist society. I have my strong doubts, but here I think is an interesting question. The use value of the capitalist mode of production is temporal. It's not the amount of all the different commodities, whatever use value they have, but it's the possibility to have these kind of amount because of this enormously productive relation between living and dead labor time and surplus and necessary labor time.
A completely different concept of use value than what Keti is talking about. I mean, you're talking on totally different things.
No.
Sorry.
No, I said I don't talk like Keti on the average normal commodities, but on three special commodities: commodity labor power, means of production, and money.
Yes, but the question was use value.
This is use value. Marx is explicitly saying only this kind of commodity has a particular use value, that is an equivalent and non-equivalent for the capitalist owner. This is a particular and very important use value. The same goes for means of production. Marx is not talking about use value only about a car or a table or linen, but also use value of the commodity labor power and means of production.
Okay, the last point you asked me was about appearance. I'm taking that to mean, is value a form of appearance? Is that what you mean?
I could take it on the problem relation value price, how to deal with shine appearances that are necessarily produced by capitalism from this perspective of
okay, it's inherent in the nature of a commodity producing society of independent producers that they sell things for a price. That price responds to supply and demand, and as a form of appearance can rise above or fall below the value of the actual commodities. And that is part of the self-regulating process of commodity-producing society, and is why Marx, in The Poverty of Philosophy, is saying it's impossible in a commodity-producing society to make appearance in the form of value, in the form of price, exactly correspond to value behind it. Now, that doesn't mean you cannot make value appear. You could, in a socialist economy, have in every supermarket the labor content of the goods you buy, just as the calorie content is currently displayed. But that would not necessarily be the amount of labor you have to give up of your labor time to get that, because even in the socialist economy, if there is a bad harvest or if there's fluctuations in the material conditions of production, there may be shortages or overproduction. And it's therefore necessary in a socialist economy, even if you're abolishing money and doing everything in labor accounts, you'd sometimes have to mark some things up and mark other things down at the rate you had to give up your labor credits in the store.
This person is beyond opinion. Okay, we really have to close now. I'm sorry now that the discussion is becoming so lively, and the fourth wall has been broken of the theater. But yeah, we will have to wrap it up here. I would like to remind you all that the foundation requires us to sign those participation forms over there. And also, if you don't mind, for Hela Panke, put in €1 or €2 in that box, whatever. What's the word in German? Dose. Spendose. Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming.